Attack him. The command cracked across the freezing Halifax waterfront like a rifle shot in winter air. For one terrible second, nobody moved. Snow drifted sideways beneath the harbor lights, thin and silver against the black Atlantic beyond the pier. Phones were already raised. People had begun recording long before Officer Nathan Mercer tightened his grip on the leash. In a city where rumors spread faster than storms off the coast, everyone believed the old man kneeling near Pier 21 was dangerous. The flashing red and blue lights from two RCMP cruisers painted the wet pavement in restless colors. A ferry horn groaned somewhere out on the water. The smell of diesel, salt, and old wood clung to the evening like memory. Nathan stood rigid in the center of it all, broad-shouldered beneath his dark tactical jacket, snow collecting along the seams of his sleeves. His pale face looked carved from cold stone. The radio on his shoulder hissed with overlapping voices, but he barely heard them now. His eyes stayed fixed on the trembling figure before him. Walter Byrne looked small against the chaos. 72 years old. White beard dusted with snow. Thin winter coat buttoned wrong in his shaking hands. He clutched a weathered wooden box against his chest so tightly his knuckles had gone colorless. "Sir, put the box down," Nathan ordered again, his voice lower this time, sharper. Walter did not answer immediately. He only looked toward the harbor, eyes wet from wind or grief. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he whispered at last. A woman somewhere behind the police tape shouted, then opened the box. More phones lifted. Someone else muttered the word bomb. Nathan felt the pressure building around him the way storms build over open water. One wrong move. One hesitation. One mistake caught on camera. Beside him stood Coda. The Doberman's black and rust coat gleamed beneath the emergency lights, powerful muscles taut beneath the harness marked Police K9. Snowflakes melted across his cropped ears. He looked forward without blinking, amber eyes locked on the old man. Nathan had worked with Coda for almost 4 years. The dog obeyed commands faster than most officers reacted to danger. Drug searches. Assault suspects. Missing children in snowstorms north of Truro. Coda had never failed him. Not once. "Last warning," Nathan said. Walter slowly lowered his head. His voice trembled. "This belonged to my son." Nathan's jaw tightened. He had heard every story imaginable from frightened people trying to buy sympathy. His gloved hand rose slightly. "Coda," he commanded quietly. The Doberman leaned forward. The crowd collectively held its breath. A young reporter near the barricade whispered into her microphone, "The K9 unit is moving in now." Snow hissed softly against jackets and cruiser hoods. Somewhere nearby, church bells echoed faintly through downtown Halifax. Nathan pointed directly at the old man. "Attack." Coda exploded forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Walter closed his eyes. But then the impossible happened. Halfway there, the Doberman slowed. His pace changed completely. Instead of lunging, Coda approached the old man carefully, almost cautiously. Then he pressed himself between Walter and the officers. The harbor fell silent. Nathan froze. Coda did not bark. Did not growl. The Doberman simply stood there, broad chest rising in slow breaths, shielding the old man with his own body. Walter stared down at the dog in disbelief. Snow gathered across the animal's dark back. Then Coda did something that made the entire waterfront stop breathing. He gently rested his head against Walter Byrne's trembling knee. Phones lowered. No one spoke. Nathan felt something cold move through his chest that had nothing to do with the Atlantic wind. Because Coda was staring past the old man now. Watching someone else. The wind off Halifax Harbour cut harder as the silence settled over the pier. Nobody understood what they had just witnessed. A trained police Doberman had ignored a direct command in front of nearly 40 people, 2 patrol units, and a dozen cameras. Nathan Mercer felt every eye turning toward him now instead of the old man. His jaw tightened beneath the cold. Coda remained planted in front of Walter Byrne, motionless except for the slow rise of his chest. Snow clung to the dog's whiskers. The old man's trembling hand hovered uncertainly above the Doberman's head before finally resting against the warm black fur. Coda did not pull away. He closed his eyes for half a second, almost like recognition. Nathan stepped forward carefully, boots crunching against salt-stained ice. "Coda," he called firmly. The Doberman's ears twitched, but he did not move. That was what unsettled Nathan most. Not aggression. Not confusion. Choice. Coda was choosing. A murmur spread through the crowd gathered behind the barricades. The young reporter lowered her microphone slightly, uncertainty replacing excitement in her expression. Even the flashing cruiser lights seemed quieter now beneath the drifting snow. Walter looked exhausted. Up close, Nathan could see how thin the old man truly was. The cuffs of his coat were frayed. His cheeks hollow from too many cold winters and too few warm meals. But his eyes carried something Nathan had learned to notice after 20 years in uniform. Grief. Not fear. Not deception. Grief sat differently inside a person. Heavy. Permanent. Like an old injury that never healed correctly. Walter swallowed hard before speaking. He remembers. Nathan frowned. What? The old man glanced down at Coda. Dogs remember things people stop seeing. Before Nathan could respond, another officer pushed through the crowd from behind the cruisers. Officer Dean Holloway. Mid-40s. Tall. Clean-shaven. Dark wool cap pulled low against the wind. Snow dusted his shoulders as he approached quickly, one gloved hand resting near his utility belt. "What's going on here?" Dean asked sharply. "Why hasn't the suspect been secured?" Nathan exhaled slowly. "Coda isn't responding properly." Dean's eyes narrowed immediately toward Walter. "Then pull the dog back and do your job." Something changed in Coda the instant Dean stepped closer. The Doberman stiffened almost invisibly. Not enough for civilians to notice. But Nathan noticed. For years working beside the animal had taught him every shift of muscle and breath. Coda's head lowered slightly. His amber eyes locked onto Dean with sudden intensity. A low sound vibrated deep inside the Doberman's chest. Not loud. Barely audible beneath the harbor wind. But unmistakable. Dean stopped walking. "Control your dog, Mercer." Nathan grabbed the leash tighter. "Coda." The Doberman did not look away from Dean. Walter's breathing quickened beside him. The old man clutched the wooden box closer against his ribs as though protecting something sacred. Nathan finally noticed the faded engraving burned into the lid. A maple leaf beside military initials. The wood itself was scarred and weathered from years of handling. Walter saw Nathan looking. "My boy carried this overseas," he whispered softly. Dean's expression hardened instantly. "Enough of this." He stepped forward again, faster this time. "Open the damn box." Coda growled. The sound rolled across the pier like distant thunder. Several people in the crowd stepped backward. Nathan's stomach tightened. This was wrong. Everything suddenly felt wrong. Snow swept sideways across the harbor lights while the Atlantic crashed softly against the pilings below. The pier. Nathan could hear his own pulse now beneath the radio chatter. Dean forced a short laugh that sounded far too brittle for the situation. "What's the matter with him tonight?" he muttered. But Coda was no longer watching Walter Byrne. The Doberman stared only at Dean Holloway now, muscles tense beneath the black harness, as if listening to something no human being on that frozen pier could hear. Then Walter finally whispered the words that made the cold feel deeper than winter. "My son used to say evil smells different to dogs. The snow kept falling over Halifax Harbour in slow quiet sheets, softening the noise of the city beyond the waterfront. Yet beneath that calm, something dangerous had begun to shift. Nathan Mercer felt it in the leash clenched inside his gloved hand. Coda had entered a state Nathan had only witnessed twice before during tactical deployments near the Nova Scotia Border Task Force. Absolute focus. The Doberman no longer cared about the crowd, the flashing lights, or the old man kneeling beside him. His entire body had narrowed toward one target alone. Officer Dean Holloway. Dean forced another uneasy smile as several civilians continued filming from behind the tape barriers. "People are watching, Mercer," he muttered quietly. "Pull the dog back before this turns into a circus." Nathan did not answer immediately. He was watching Coda too carefully now. The Doberman's breathing had slowed almost unnaturally. Every muscle beneath the dark coat looked coiled with restraint rather than aggression. There was no chaos in the animal. No confusion. Only certainty. Walter Burns slowly rose from his knees with visible effort, still holding the wooden box tightly against his chest. Snow had gathered along his shoulders and in the folds of his white beard. He looked less like a threat now and more like a tired grandfather caught in the middle of a storm he never asked for. "Please," Walter whispered softly. "Just let me leave." Dean stepped forward instantly. "Not happening." His voice came too fast. Too sharp. Nathan noticed it immediately. Dean was usually composed during field incidents. Calm under pressure. Tonight there was sweat forming near his temple despite the freezing air rolling in from the Atlantic. Coda noticed it too. The Doberman's nose twitched once. Then again. Nathan remembered something an old K9 instructor in Ottawa once told him during advanced K9 certification. Training. Dogs smell fear differently than humans do. But guilt smells different from fear. Fear wants escape. Guilt waits for exposure. Nathan had laughed at the idea back then. Tonight, standing on a frozen pier beneath police lights and drifting snow, he no longer found it funny. "Nathan," Dean said more firmly now, "secure the old man." Coda let out another low growl. The sound seemed to vibrate directly through the wet pavement beneath their boots. A few people in the crowd backed away farther. The young reporter slowly lowered her camera altogether. Even she could sense the tension changing direction now. Walter looked toward Nathan with tired eyes. "Your dog already knows," he said quietly. Nathan frowned. "Knows what?" Before Walter could answer, Dean suddenly moved closer and grabbed for the wooden box. "Enough games." Walter recoiled immediately, clutching the box against himself. "Do not touch that." The old man's voice cracked with something deeper than panic. Pain. Real pain. Coda reacted instantly. The Doberman stepped between them so fast the leash snapped tight in Nathan's hand. Not attacking. Blocking. Defending. Dean stopped short. His face lost color for a brief second before anger replaced it. "Control your animal." Nathan stared at him carefully now. The harbor wind carried the scent of saltwater, diesel fuel, wet wool, and fresh snow. But beneath all of it, Coda remained fixed on Dean with unwavering intensity. Nathan slowly realized something chilling. The Doberman had not protected Walter because he was weak. He had protected him because Coda believed he was in danger. From a police officer. Somewhere behind them, church bells rang again across downtown Halifax. Slow. Hollow. Almost mournful. Walter closed his eyes briefly as the sound drifted over the harbor. "My son heard those bells the morning before he died," he whispered. Dean's jaw tightened instantly. Too instantly. Nathan caught it this time. The reaction was small but undeniable. Coda caught it too. The Doberman's ears lifted sharply. Then the dog took one slow deliberate step toward Dean Holloway, and for the first time that entire night, Nathan Mercer felt afraid of what the truth might actually be. The cold along the Halifax waterfront seemed to deepen after Walter Burns spoke those words. My son heard those bells the morning before he died. The sentence lingered in the air heavier than the snow drifting across the pier. Nathan Mercer watched. Officer Dean Holloway carefully now, no longer through the automatic trust built between officers over years in uniform, but through the sharpened instinct Coda had forced awake inside him. Dean recovered quickly, too quickly. He straightened his jacket and forced irritation back into his voice. This old man is manipulating the situation, he snapped. And your dog is feeding into it. Nathan did not answer right away. Coda stood rigid beside Walter, his dark eyes still locked onto Dean without blinking. The Doberman's posture was not defensive anymore. It was watchful. Calculating. Like a soldier waiting for the moment danger finally revealed itself. Snow gathered along the edges of the police tape while more civilians slowly formed a wider circle around the scene. Some stood beneath umbrellas near the Harbor Cafe across the street. Others remained inside idling cars, headlights glowing through the swirling white air. Phone cameras continued recording. Nathan could almost feel the weight of public judgment pressing against his shoulders. One wrong move tonight and the footage would spread across every screen in Canada by morning. Dean stepped closer again, lowering his voice. You are losing control of this scene. Nathan finally looked at him directly. Maybe I never had control. The answer caught Dean off guard. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered openly across his face. Walter coughed weakly beside them, the sound rough from cold air and exhaustion. Nathan noticed how tightly the old man continued holding the wooden box. Not like evidence. Like memory. Like grief itself had physical weight. Sir, Nathan said quietly now, his tone completely different than before, what was your son's name? Walter hesitated for a moment. Snowflakes settled in his eyebrows and melted slowly against weathered skin. Liam Byrne, he whispered. Dean immediately looked away toward the harbor. It lasted less than a second. But Nathan saw it. Coda saw it too. The Doberman released another low rumble deep in his chest. Walter noticed the reaction and gently rested his shaking hand along the dog's neck. Easy, boy, he murmured softly. You already know. Nathan felt something tighten in his stomach. He had heard the name Liam Byrne before. Not recently. Years ago. Internal reports. Military intelligence cooperation. Something involving missing firearms moving through Atlantic shipping routes between Nova Scotia and the northeastern United States. The details had faded with time, buried beneath newer cases and endless paperwork. But one memory remained clear. A whistleblower had died before testimony could be completed. Officially ruled an accident. Nathan slowly turned back toward Dean. You worked port security 7 years ago, did you not? Dean's face hardened instantly. What does that have to do with anything? Before Nathan could answer, Coda suddenly moved. Not aggressively. Not violently. The Doberman simply stepped forward until he stood directly beside Dean. Close enough to smell him fully now. The dog's nose twitched once near the officer's jacket pocket. Then Coda stopped breathing for half a heartbeat. Nathan noticed immediately. Every handler learns that moment. Detection. The Doberman slowly lifted his eyes toward Nathan. Waiting. Snow hissed across the pavement beneath the harbor lights. Nathan's pulse began to pound in his ears. Dean, he said carefully, what is in your pocket? Dean laughed once, but there was no warmth in it. Are you serious? Coda did not move. Nathan extended his hand calmly. Let me see it. The crowd had gone completely silent now except for the distant crash of waves against frozen pilings below the pier. Walter Byrne looked suddenly exhausted beyond words, as though the burden he carried for years was finally reaching its end. Dean glanced toward the growing crowd. Toward the cameras. Toward the harbor road leading out of downtown Halifax. Then he took one slow step backward. Coda instantly matched him. Dean Holloway's boots scraped softly across the icy pavement as he stepped backward again. It was a small movement, almost invisible beneath the flashing cruiser lights and drifting snow, but Coda followed instantly. The Doberman moved with slow deliberate precision, every muscle tight beneath his black harness. Nathan Mercer kept his eyes fixed on Dean now, no longer seeing a fellow officer standing on the Halifax waterfront, but a man trying very hard not to panic. The Atlantic wind carried the faint cry of gulls somewhere beyond the dark harbor. Around them, nobody spoke. Civilians stood frozen behind the barricades, phones lowered halfway as confusion replaced curiosity. The young reporter near the tape watched silently, microphone hanging forgotten at her side. Walter Byrne remained motionless beside the pier railing, clutching the wooden box against his chest as though it contained the last surviving piece of his life. Nathan extended his hand again toward Dean. "Show me what is in your pocket." Dean's expression tightened. "You seriously think a dog is evidence now?" Nathan did not blink. "I think my dog has never been wrong." For a brief moment, only snow moved between them. White flakes spiraled through the harbor lights, settling on jackets, patrol cars, and frozen ropes tied along the dock posts below. Then Dean forced a dry laugh and reached slowly into his coat pocket. Nathan's shoulders remained tense, ready for anything, but what Dean pulled out was only a small silver flash drive. Several people in the crowd exhaled softly. Dean held it up with visible irritation. "Satisfied?" But Coda was not satisfied. The Doberman's stare never left Dean's face. Nathan frowned slightly. Something still felt wrong. The flash drive trembled faintly in Dean's gloved hand. Not from cold. Fear. Real fear. Walter suddenly spoke, his tired voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "That belonged to my son." Dean snapped toward him immediately. "You need to stop talking." The sharpness in his voice made several people glance at one another uneasily. Nathan slowly took the flash drive from Dean's hand. There was no label on it. Just scratches along the metal casing and a faded piece of black tape wrapped near the end. Walter stared at it like a man staring into a grave. "Liam hid everything there," he whispered. "Shipping records. Names. Payments." Nathan looked up carefully. "Payments for what?" Walter swallowed hard before answering. "Weapons moving through the port." The harbor suddenly felt colder than before. Dean stepped forward quickly. "This is nonsense." Coda growled instantly. Deep. Sharp. Warning. Dean stopped again. Nathan's pulse hammered beneath his jacket now. Pieces were beginning to connect in ways he did not like. 7 years ago, Liam Byrne had died before giving testimony connected to smuggling routes operating between Halifax and northern Maine. Official reports blamed icy roads near Cape Breton. Single vehicle accident. Case closed within days. Nathan remembered because several officers had questioned how quickly the investigation disappeared afterward. Walter's eyes glistened beneath the falling snow. "My son tried to do the right thing." His voice cracked slightly. "And they buried him for it." Dean shook his head hard. "You are senile." But Nathan noticed something else then. Dean's right hand remained partially inside his coat pocket. Hidden. Careful. Coda noticed too. The Doberman's posture shifted instantly from caution to readiness. Nathan's voice lowered. "Dean." No answer. "Take your hand out slowly." The crowd seemed to stop breathing altogether. Even the wind off the Atlantic felt distant now. Dean's eyes moved once toward the road leading away from the waterfront. Calculation. Escape. Nathan saw it clearly. So did Coda. The Doberman suddenly stepped forward, placing himself directly between Dean and the street behind him. Not attacking. Blocking. Preventing movement. Dean stared down at the dog with visible hatred now. Move the animal. Nathan did not move. Take your hand out. For 3 long seconds, nobody on the Halifax pier spoke. Then Dean slowly removed his hand from his pocket. A second flash drive rested in his palm. Smaller. Black. Unmarked. Walter Byrne closed his eyes like a man finally watching the truth crawl out into daylight after years buried in darkness. And beside Nathan Mercer, Coda stopped growling at last. The second flash drive looked harmless resting in Dean Holloway's trembling hand. Small. Black. Barely larger than a house key. Yet the moment it appeared beneath the harbor lights, Walter Byrne lowered his head like a man standing beside his son's grave all over again. Snow drifted silently across the Halifax pier, settling over police cruisers and frozen ropes along the waterfront. Nobody in the crowd spoke anymore. Even the people recording seemed unsure whether they were witnessing a police investigation or a confession slowly clawing its way into the open. Nathan Mercer stared at the drive carefully. Why were you hiding it? Dean's eyes hardened immediately. I was not hiding anything. But his voice had changed. The confidence was gone now, replaced by something thinner. Fraying around the edges. Coda remained perfectly still beside Nathan, though the Doberman's amber eyes never left Dean for even a second. The dog no longer growled. He did not need to. His silence carried enough warning already. Walter's breathing shook visibly in the cold. Liam copied everything before he died, he whispered. He said if anything happened to him, someone would eventually listen. Nathan slowly turned toward the old man. You have known about this drive for 7 years. Walter nodded once. I did not know who to trust. His eyes drifted toward Dean. Looks like I was right. A gust of Atlantic wind swept through the pier, rattling the barricades softly. Somewhere behind the harbor buildings, a church bell rang the late evening hour. Deep. Hollow. The sound carried across the snow like an old memory refusing to disappear. Nathan extended his hand toward Dean again. Give it to me. Dean hesitated. Only for a moment. But it was enough. Coda stepped forward instantly, posture tightening again beneath the harness. Nathan felt the leash pull lightly in his hand. The Doberman sensed it too. Resistance. Fear. Desperation. Dean finally handed over the black drive. Nathan held both devices now, one silver, one black, their surfaces cold against his gloves. 2 tiny pieces of metal suddenly heavy enough to bend an entire night sideways. Walter carefully lowered himself onto a nearby wooden bench along the pier, exhausted beyond words. Snow gathered on his shoulders as though winter itself had been waiting years for him to finally stop running. He looked toward the dark Atlantic beyond the harbor lights. My son loved this city, he murmured softly. Even after everything. Nathan remained standing beside Coda, trying to steady the growing unease inside his chest. What exactly did Liam discover? Walter swallowed hard before answering. Weapons moved through shipping containers marked as medical aid. Several people in the crowd exchanged shocked glances. Walter continued quietly. Not large military shipments. Small transfers. Quiet ones. Handguns. Restricted rifles. Parts. His voice cracked slightly. Enough to disappear into criminal networks without anyone noticing. Dean suddenly laughed once under his breath. Bitter. Sharp. You are making stories for sympathy. But Nathan noticed something again. Dean kept glancing toward the harbor road. Measuring distance. Calculating exits. Coda noticed too. The Doberman shifted one step sideways, cutting off the line between Dean and the street without needing a command. Nathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow now. Coda was not reacting like a patrol dog anymore. He was protecting the scene itself. Protecting the truth. Walter slowly opened the wooden box resting on his lap. The hinges creaked softly beneath the wind. Inside lay neatly folded military papers, old photographs, tarnished dog tags, and a framed picture of a young man smiling beside the Halifax Harbour years earlier. Liam Byrne. Blonde hair. Blue winter jacket. One arm wrapped around an older Doberman with alert ears and intelligent eyes. Nathan stared at the photograph. "Your son had a dog?" Walter nodded faintly. "His name was Archer." Coda stepped closer to the photograph immediately, nose twitching softly above the frame. Then something almost unbearable crossed Walter's face. Not shock. Recognition. "No." The old man whispered. "It cannot be." Nathan frowned. "What?" Walter looked down at Coda with trembling eyes shining beneath the harbor lights. "Archer had a litter before Liam died." The Doberman slowly lifted his head toward Walter Byrne as snow fell silently around them both. And for the first time that entire night, the old man began to cry. Walter Byrne's tears fell quietly onto the old photograph resting inside the wooden box. Snow gathered along the edges of the frame while the Halifax Harbour lights shimmered against the dark Atlantic behind him. The image of Liam Byrne beside the older Doberman seemed to pull something invisible through the frozen air between the past and the present. Coda stood completely still near the bench now, his amber eyes fixed on the photograph as though he recognized something buried far deeper than scent. Nathan Mercer felt the night shifting again beneath his feet. Not toward violence. Toward truth. The crowd along the pier had gone strangely silent, the kind of silence that only comes when people realize they may have judged the wrong person too quickly. Even the young reporter had lowered her camera completely now. Dean Holloway remained near the barricade, shoulders tense beneath the falling snow. His confidence had almost disappeared entirely. Nathan could see it in the way he kept swallowing between breaths. In the way his eyes searched constantly for escape. Walter carefully touched the photograph with trembling fingers. "Archer was all Liam trusted near the end," he whispered softly. "He said dogs still recognized honest people after humans stopped trying." Coda slowly stepped closer until his nose hovered near the picture frame again. Then the Doberman gently touched the photograph once with the front of his muzzle. Walter inhaled sharply. "Same eyes," he murmured. "Same way of watching." Nathan looked down at Coda differently now. He had adopted the Doberman from a specialized police breeding program outside Moncton almost 4 years earlier. The records had mentioned strong bloodlines and exceptional detection instincts, but nothing more. No history connected to Halifax. No mention of Archer. Yet somehow the possibility settled heavily inside him. Blood remembered things. Maybe loyalty did too. A gust of wind swept across the pier, rattling the nearby chain barriers. Walter slowly closed the wooden box again and wiped his eyes with stiff shaking fingers. Liam tried to expose them quietly at first. He said. He trusted internal investigations. Trusted supervisors. His tired eyes lifted toward Dean. That was his mistake. Nathan's jaw tightened. You believe Dean was involved from the beginning? Before Walter could answer, Dean finally snapped. This old man has no proof. His voice cracked louder than intended. Several civilians flinched at the sudden outburst. Coda immediately turned toward him again. Not growling this time. Watching. Dean pointed toward Walter with a shaking hand. He has spent 7 years turning grief into conspiracy. Nathan slowly stepped between them. Then why are you scared? Dean froze. The harbor wind seemed to disappear completely for one suspended moment. Snow drifted silently through the cruiser lights while the Atlantic rolled black and endless beyond the pier. Nathan could hear the faint creak of boats rocking against frozen docks below. Dean's face hardened again, but now it looked less like authority and more like desperation. Because you are about to destroy careers over the instincts of a dog. Nathan looked down briefly at Coda standing beside him. The Doberman's posture remained calm. Certain. Unmoved by noise or accusation. Nathan remembered every search Coda had ever conducted. Missing children found beneath snowbanks outside Dartmouth. Elderly hikers located in freezing rain near Cape Split. Narcotics hidden behind false truck panels at the New Brunswick border. The dog had never once reacted without reason. Not once. Walter's voice softened almost to a whisper. Liam told me something before he died. Nathan turned back toward him. What? The old man stared out over the dark Atlantic. He said the dangerous men were not the loud ones. Snow collected along his coat sleeves like ash. The dangerous ones smiled while they buried the truth. Dean suddenly stepped backward again. Faster this time. Coda reacted instantly. The Doberman moved with him in one smooth motion, blocking the path toward the harbor road before Nathan even tightened the leash. Several officers near the cruisers finally began noticing the tension turning serious. Hands lowered cautiously toward radios. Nathan's pulse hammered beneath his jacket now. Dean's eyes flicked once toward the black flash drive still resting in Nathan's gloved hand. Then toward the water beyond the pier. And for the first time all night, Nathan Mercer realized Dean Holloway was not afraid of losing his job. He was afraid of what was hidden inside those files. The snow had begun falling harder over Halifax Harbour by the time Nathan Mercer finally spoke into his radio. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Requesting supervisory unit and internal affairs presence at Pier 21. The words carried across the frozen waterfront with quiet finality. Around him, the atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier that night, civilians had gathered expecting danger from an old man with a wooden box. Now every uncertain glance had shifted toward Officer Dean Holloway instead. Dean stood near the barricade beneath the flashing blue lights, shoulders rigid, eyes restless. Coda remained between him and the harbor road without needing a single command. The Doberman's calm was somehow more intimidating than aggression would have been. Nathan tightened his grip slightly on the leash while snow collected along his dark gloves. He could feel his own thoughts unraveling beneath the cold. For years he had trusted instinct only when it came from training manuals, protocols, supervisors, evidence. Tonight a dog had forced him to confront something harder. Sometimes truth arrived long before paperwork did. Walter Burns sat quietly on the bench facing the Atlantic, the wooden box resting across his knees. His breathing looked shallow now, exhausted from carrying grief too heavy for one man through 7 Canadian winters. Nathan walked toward him slowly. The harbor lights reflected softly in the old man's watery eyes. "You should have come to someone sooner," Nathan said quietly. Walter gave a faint tired smile. "I tried." His gaze drifted toward the water beyond the pier. People listened politely. Then files disappeared. Snow settled across the bench beside him in thin white layers. "After Liam died, officers stopped returning my calls." Nathan lowered his eyes briefly. Shame moved through him sharper than the wind. Earlier that same night, he had nearly unleashed Coda on a grieving father simply because fear and public pressure demanded immediate action. The realization sat heavy inside his chest. "I am sorry," he said at last. The words felt painfully small against everything that had happened. Walter remained silent for a moment. Then he looked down at Coda standing beside Nathan. The Doberman's amber eyes softened the instant Walter met them. "You are not the one who failed me tonight," the old man whispered. "Your dog saved what little faith I still had left." Nathan swallowed hard but could not answer. Across the pier, Dean suddenly raised his voice again toward approaching officers near the cruisers. "This is insanity. You are trusting an animal over a decorated officer. But the force behind his anger was collapsing now. Nobody rushed to support him anymore. Too many people had witnessed the fear in his eyes. Too many cameras had recorded Coda refusing to leave Walter Byrne unprotected. The truth had already escaped into the cold Halifax air where it could no longer be buried quietly inside filing cabinets. Nathan looked toward Dean one final time. "If the drives are clean," he said calmly, "then you have nothing to fear." Dean did not respond. Snowflakes melted slowly against his pale face as he stared toward the Atlantic beyond the pier. For a brief moment he looked less like a corrupt officer and more like a tired man cornered by years of choices finally returning home. Coda watched him carefully but no longer growled. The Doberman seemed to understand something Nathan only now began learning himself. Justice did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it simply stood still long enough for guilt to reveal itself. Walter slowly opened the wooden box once more. He removed Liam's old dog tags and held them gently in his weathered hands. The metal clinked softly beneath the wind. "My son believed loyalty was sacred," he murmured. "That is why betrayal destroyed him." Nathan stared quietly at the tags gleaming beneath the harbor lights. Then he felt Coda lean lightly against his leg for the first time that night. Not alerting. Not warning. Comforting. The simple warmth of the Doberman against the freezing cold nearly broke something inside him. Walter noticed it too and smiled faintly through tired eyes. "He forgives faster than people do," the old man whispered. Snow continued falling across the pier while church bells echoed softly somewhere beyond downtown Halifax. And beneath those quiet winter sounds, Nathan Mercer finally understood the difference between obedience and honor. By the time the last police cruiser pulled away from Pier 21, midnight had settled fully over Halifax Harbour. The snowstorm had softened into a quiet drift now, covering the frozen waterfront in pale silver under the harbour lamps. Most of the crowd had disappeared hours earlier. The reporters were gone. The flashing lights were gone. Even the sharp tension that had gripped the pier all evening seemed to have dissolved into the Atlantic wind rolling slowly through the empty docks. Only 3 figures remained near the water. Walter Byrne sat alone on the wooden bench facing the dark ocean, Liam's old dog tags resting in his weathered hands. Nathan Mercer stood several meters away beside Coda, watching the old man in silence. The Doberman's breath curled softly into the freezing air. Somewhere out beyond the harbor, a foghorn sounded low and mournful against the night. Nathan had not spoken much since Internal Affairs escorted Dean Holloway away. There had been no dramatic struggle. No shouting. Just a tired man finally realizing there was nowhere left to run from himself. The black flash drive had contained enough evidence to reopen cases buried for nearly a decade. Shipping logs. Names. Offshore payments routed through shell companies operating between Nova Scotia and northern Maine. Liam Byrne had been telling the truth all along. And an old father had spent 7 winters carrying that truth alone because nobody listened carefully enough. Nathan looked down briefly at Coda beside him. Snow rested along the Doberman's back in a thin white layer, but the dog remained still and patient, his amber eyes fixed gently on Walter. Earlier that night those same eyes had seen through fear, authority, and lies without hesitation. Nathan wondered how many human beings could say the same about themselves. He slowly approached the bench, boots crunching softly across the snow-covered boards. Walter looked up as Nathan stopped beside him. For a moment neither man spoke. The harbor lights reflected across the old man's tired face, softening the deep lines carved there by grief and years of disappointment. Nathan finally held out a warm paper coffee cup. "Double-double," he said quietly. "Only thing open this late." Walter stared at the cup for a second before accepting it with trembling hands. "Thank you." Nathan sat beside him slowly while Coda settled near their feet, calm and watchful against the frozen night. The Atlantic rolled endlessly before them, black waves moving beneath drifting snow like quiet breathing. I almost made the worst mistake of my career tonight, Nathan admitted after a long silence. Walter shook his head faintly. No, he glanced down toward Coda. You stopped before it was too late. Nathan exhaled slowly into the cold air. Because he stopped me. The old man smiled for the first time that night. Small. Tired. Real. Coda gently rested his head against Walter's knee again, exactly as he had done hours earlier when the entire pier believed the old man was dangerous. Walter's weathered fingers disappeared slowly into the dark fur around the Doberman's neck. Archer used to do that, he whispered softly. Whenever Liam carried too much pain. Nathan watched the scene quietly, something heavy loosening inside his chest for the first time in years. The police academy had taught him procedure. Tactical response. Threat assessment. But nothing in 20 years of service had prepared him for the lesson a Doberman taught him on a freezing Halifax pier. Obedience mattered. But conscience mattered more. A church bell echoed faintly through the sleeping city behind them. One slow chime carried over the harbor wind before fading into silence again. Walter looked out toward the dark Atlantic and closed his eyes briefly. Liam would have liked him, he murmured. Coda lifted his ears slightly at the sound of the name, then settled closer beside the bench. Nathan looked toward the endless black water where snowflakes disappeared the instant they touched the waves. Some dogs are trained to follow commands, he said quietly. Walter nodded once, still staring at the ocean. And the rare ones, he whispered, follow the truth instead. The wind carried the words softly across the empty harbor while snow continued falling over the three quiet souls beside the sea.